The champagne flute shattered against the marble column, sending crystalline fragments skittering across the polished floor of the hotel bar like deadly rain. There was no time to run, no time to negotiate with security, and certainly no time to hope the police would arrive before Derek did what he came to do. The lounge was filled with the murmur of business deals and soft jazz, a civilized veneer that couldn't mask the violence crackling in the air. "You really thought you could hide from me, Ave?" Derek's voice cut through the ambient noise like a blade through silk. Avery Monroe didn't turn around. She pushed away from the bar, her heels catching on the edge of the plush carpet as she stumbled toward the lobby. She had fled 6,000 miles across the Pacific. She had changed her phone number, her email, deleted every trace of her digital footprint, and taken a translation job that paid cash under the table. But Derek, her ex, a man whose love had metastasized into ownership and whose rage was a promise of destruction, had found her. He always found her. She weaved through clusters of hotel guests, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The main exit was blocked. Two men in dark suits with American builds and dead expressions stood near the revolving doors, Derek's hired muscle. She was trapped in this gilded cage, a five-star hotel where foreign businessmen came to make their fortunes in Seoul's economic boom. She looked left, hotel security, but they wouldn't intervene in what looked like a domestic dispute. She looked right, the elevators, too exposed, too slow. Then she looked across the lobby toward the private restaurant entrance cordoned off with velvet ropes. The lighting there was different, darker, more intimate. A section of the restaurant had been reserved, surrounded by men in immaculate suits who stood with their hands folded, not socializing, not eating. They were watching. And seated at the center table, partially obscured by the shadows and the carefully arranged privacy screens, was a man who looked like he commanded the night itself. Seo Dong-Hyun. Avery knew the name. Every translator working in Seoul's gray markets knew the name. He wasn't just a criminal. He was an empire. The Viper of Gangnam, a man who controlled the underground gambling dens in Itaewon and the smuggling routes through Incheon port. It was whispered that prosecutors didn't file charges when Dong-Hyun's name appeared on evidence lists because even justice had learned to negotiate with him first. Derek was close now. She could hear his footsteps, the deliberate rhythm of a predator who knew his prey had nowhere left to run. His hand shot out, fingers wrapping around her upper arm hard enough that she felt bones grind together. "Walk," Derek hissed in her ear, his breath hot against her neck. "Don't make a scene, or I'll break your wrist right here in front of everyone." Avery looked at the cordoned-off restaurant section again. It was the most dangerous place in the entire hotel. Approaching Seo Dong-Hyun, uninvited, was a death sentence wrapped in expensive tailoring. But walking out those revolving doors with Derek was a guarantee: pain, isolation, and eventually disappearance. It was a choice between a monster she knew and a monster she didn't. "No," she breathed. She wrenched her arm back with strength she didn't know she possessed, the sudden resistance catching Derek off balance. Before he could recover, before his bodyguards could close in, she bolted, not toward the exit, but straight toward the velvet ropes and the wall of silent men guarding the private section. "Ma'am, this area is reserved," one of the guards started, stepping into her path. Avery didn't stop. She didn't slow down. She ducked under his outstretched arm, ignoring the hands that grabbed at her dress, and stumbled past the privacy screens into the sanctum of Seoul's underworld. The ambient noise of the hotel seemed to evaporate instantly, though the jazz still played somewhere in the distance. She didn't try to run past the man at the center table. She ran to him. Avery collapsed to her knees beside Seo Dong-Hyun's perfectly polished shoes, her dress tearing slightly as it caught on the carpet. The movement was so sudden, so desperate, and so utterly submissive that the entire section froze. Three of his men drew weapons, the metallic clicks of safeties disengaging barely audible. The muzzles were pointed at her head. Dong-Hyun didn't flinch. He didn't even shift in his seat. He sat with one leg crossed over the other, a glass of whiskey resting on the white tablecloth beside him, his expression an unreadable sculpture of ice and calculation. His neck bore intricate tattoos that disappeared beneath his collar, patterns that looked like serpents coiling upward. He looked down at her, a black woman in a cocktail dress, gasping for air, tears streaming down her brown skin, kneeling at the feet of the most feared man in Seoul. "Please," Avery whispered, her voice shaking but clear in the pocket of silence that had formed around them. She didn't look at the guns. She looked only at him, into eyes that were dark, fathomless, and utterly devoid of warmth. "If you don't protect me, he'll kill me." The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. Dong-Hyun's tattooed fingers tapped once against his whiskey glass. Behind her, she heard Derek's voice rising in the lobby, demanding the guards let him through. Seo Dong-Hyun's lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Stand up," he said in Korean-accented English, his voice quiet as smoke. "Let me see what I'm being asked to protect." Avery rose on trembling legs, aware of every eye in the room dissecting her like specimen under glass. Dong-Hyun gestured lazily to the chair across from him, and she sat, feeling the weight of the guns still trained on her skull. Derek's shouting grew louder in the lobby, hotel security clearly struggling to contain him. "You have approximately 90 seconds before that commotion reaches this table," Dong-Hyun said, lifting his whiskey glass to his lips. "Use them wisely." The words tumbled out in a desperate cascade. The stalking. The restraining order that meant nothing once she crossed international borders. Derek's family connections, his money, his absolute conviction that she was property he'd misplaced. "I have nowhere left to run," she finished, hating how small her voice sounded. "He'll find me anywhere I go. Unless you're under the protection of someone he cannot touch," Dong-Hyun finished, setting down his glass with precise care. His tattooed fingers drummed once against the tablecloth. "You understand what you're asking? Protection in my world is not a restraining order or a police report. It is ownership." "I understand," Avery said, though her mouth had gone dry. "Do you?" He leaned forward, and she caught the faint scent of expensive cologne and cigarette smoke. "You will live where I tell you. You will go nowhere without my permission. You will speak to no one from your previous life. Every freedom you think you're preserving by coming to me, you're surrendering it instead. The only difference is I won't beat you for disobedience. I'll simply remove you from my protection and let nature take its course." Behind them, Derek had broken through. She heard his voice, sharp and entitled, demanding access. Dong-Hyun's men shifted, hands moving toward concealed weapons. "My answer," Avery said, her voice steadier now, "is yes." Dong-Hyun studied her for a long moment, then raised 2 fingers. One of his men appeared at his shoulder. He spoke in rapid Korean, then switched to English for her benefit. "Min-jun will escort you to my car. Wait there." He stood, buttoning his suit jacket with mechanical precision. "I'll handle your ex-boyfriend." "What are you going to?" "That's no longer your concern." His expression was carved from marble. "The moment you knelt at my feet, you stopped making decisions. Welcome to the Viper's Den, Miss Monroe." The penthouse occupied the entire 42nd floor, a sprawling expanse of white marble, glass, and chrome that felt more like an art installation than a place where humans actually lived. Floor-to-ceiling windows wrapped around 3 sides, offering a panoramic view of Seoul's glittering skyline, Namsan Tower piercing the night like a luminous needle, the Han River a dark ribbon cutting through the neon below. Avery stood in the entryway, her torn dress and scuffed heels completely incongruous with the immaculate surroundings. Min-jun watched her from across the vast living room, his arms crossed over his chest. He'd been silent during the entire drive from the hotel, but his disapproval radiated like heat from asphalt. He was younger than Dong-Hyun, maybe early 30s, with sharp features and eyes that cataloged every micro-expression on her face. "You're a liability," he said finally, his English flawless but accented. "You understand this, yes? Dong-Hyun doesn't do charity. Whatever arrangement you think you've made, it has an expiration date." Before Avery could respond, a small woman in her 60s appeared from what must have been the kitchen. She wore a simple gray hanbok and had kind eyes that crinkled at the corners when she saw Avery. She spoke in rapid Korean, gesturing at Avery's torn dress with concern, then disappeared down a hallway and returned with a silk robe. "This is Mrs. Choi," Min-jun said, his tone softening marginally. "She maintains the household. She speaks no English, but she understands enough." He translated something for Mrs. Choi, who nodded and gently guided Avery toward a bathroom that was larger than her entire previous apartment. The marble tub could have fit 3 people. The toiletries were arranged like museum pieces, expensive French brands Avery recognized from magazine advertisements. Mrs. Choi pointed to the shower, mimed washing, then laid out the robe and a pair of soft slippers. When she was alone, Avery caught her reflection in the mirror. Mascara streaked down her cheeks. Her dress hung off one shoulder. She looked like exactly what she was, a woman who'd gambled everything on a man who traded in violence and control. The water was scalding when she finally stepped under the rainfall shower head, but she didn't adjust the temperature. She needed to feel something besides the numbness spreading through her chest. She'd escaped Derek's cage only to lock herself in another one. The only question now was whether this prison came with a key, or if she'd simply traded one monster for a more elegant one. Dong-Hyun arrived sometime after midnight, his suit jacket discarded, his white shirt unbuttoned at the collar to reveal more of the serpentine tattoos that crawled up his neck. He found Avery standing by the windows in the borrowed robe, staring at the city below. He didn't announce himself, just moved to the dining table where Mrs. Choi had laid out an elaborate spread of dishes Avery couldn't identify. "Eat," he said, pulling out a chair. She sat across from him, eyeing the array of banchan, small plates of kimchi, seasoned vegetables, and things she couldn't name. He served her rice without asking, then began eating with the mechanical efficiency of someone who viewed meals as fuel rather than pleasure. "Your ex-boyfriend has been persuaded to return to the United States," Dong-Hyun said between bites, his chopsticks moving with practiced precision. "He won't be bothering you again." Avery's hand froze halfway to her mouth. "What did you—" "I showed him photographs," he interrupted calmly. "Of you entering my car. Of you entering this building. In certain circles, that is enough. Derek understands now that pursuing you means pursuing me, and unlike you, he has enough sense to recognize a war he cannot win." She set down her chopsticks, appetite vanishing. "That's it? He just leaves. His flight departs at 6 a.m. Dong-Hyun's dark eyes met hers across the table. "This is what protection looks like in my world, Miss Monroe. Not lawyers or restraining orders. Fear. Respect. The understanding that some boundaries carry lethal consequences." He pushed a document across the table. It was in Korean, dense with text she couldn't read. "These are the terms," he said. "Mrs. Choi will translate tomorrow, but I'll summarize now. You don't leave this penthouse without my explicit permission. You don't contact anyone from your previous life, no friends, no family, no former colleagues. You don't discuss me, my business, or anything you see or hear in this home. Most importantly," he leaned forward, his tattooed fingers drumming once against the wood, "you trust no one but me. Not Min-jun, not Mrs. Choi, not the guards downstairs. In my world, trust is currency. You've just spent all of yours by kneeling at my feet in a public hotel." "So I'm a prisoner," Avery said quietly. "You're protected," he corrected. "The distinction matters. Prisoners want to escape. You came here voluntarily, and you'll stay voluntarily because the alternative is worse than any cage I could build." He stood, buttoning his collar with precise movements. "Your room is the second door on the left. Get some sleep. Tomorrow, we discuss what happens next." Avery woke to the wail of sirens and an orange glow painting the bedroom walls. For a disoriented moment, she thought she was back in her old apartment, back when Derek would show up drunk at 3 a.m. pounding on the door. Then she remembered the marble floors, the impossible skyline, the tattooed man who'd promised protection at the cost of her freedom. She stumbled to the window. Somewhere in the distance, maybe 10 blocks away, flames climbed into the night sky like a beacon. Smoke billowed black against the city lights. Emergency vehicles converged from multiple directions, their sirens creating a discordant symphony. The penthouse door burst open. Min-jun stood in the threshold, his phone pressed to his ear, his face twisted with barely controlled rage. He barked something in Korean, then switched to English when he saw Avery.
Get dressed. Now.
She pulled on the clothes Mrs. Choi had left, simple black pants and a sweater, and followed him to the living room. Dong-Hyun stood by the windows, perfectly still in his shirt sleeves, watching the distant fire with the same expression he'd worn when she'd begged for his protection. Unreadable. Cold. Minjun's phone buzzed. He listened, then spoke in rapid Korean to Dong-Hyun. Even without understanding the words, Avery caught the fury in his tone, the accusatory glances thrown her direction. "What happened?" she asked, her voice smaller than she intended. "The Lotus," Dong-Hyun said without turning. "One of my nightclubs in Itaewon. Someone bypassed security, poured accelerant through the VIP section, and left a message spray-painted on the sidewalk." He finally looked at her, his dark eyes reflecting the distant flames. "Return what's mine." The air left her lungs. "Derek." He was supposed to. He boarded his flight. Dong-Hyun interrupted. And then he made a phone call before takeoff. This was arranged remotely. Clearly, I underestimated his commitment to reclaiming his property. Minjun exploded into Korean, gesturing sharply at Avery. She didn't need translation. His body language screamed everything. Liability, mistake, not worth the cost. He pointed at the door, then at Dong-Hyun, his voice rising. Dong-Hyun listened until Minjun finished, then responded in Korean, just 3 sentences, delivered with the quiet finality of a judge pronouncing sentence. Minjun's expression shifted from anger to shock, then to something like grudging acceptance. "What did you say?" Avery whispered. Dong-Hyun turned back to the window, his reflection overlaying the burning skyline. "I told him that nothing that enters my home leaves it without my permission. Not furniture. Not information." His eyes met hers in the glass. "Not you." Sleep wouldn't come. Avery lay in the pristine white bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying the orange glow of the lotus burning while Minjun argued for her removal like she was defective merchandise. At 3 a.m. she gave up, wrapping herself in the silk robe and padding barefoot through the silent penthouse. She found Dong-Hyun on the balcony, a space she had known existed, a narrow terrace accessible through a study, overlooking the southern sprawl of the city. He stood at the railing in dark slacks and an unbuttoned shirt, a cigarette burning between his tattooed fingers. He didn't turn when she approached, but his posture shifted slightly, acknowledging her presence. "Can't sleep either?" she asked. "Sleep is negotiable when you're responsible for other people's livelihoods," he said, exhaling smoke into the cold air. 3 of my employees were in the Lotus when it burned. They'll survive, but one will carry scars. Guilt twisted in her stomach. "I'm sorry. I never meant. Intent is irrelevant." He finally looked at her, his face half-shadowed in the ambient light from the city below. "In my world, we deal in consequences, not intentions." He took another drag, then gestured to the serpent tattoo that wound up his neck and disappeared behind his ear. "This one I got when I was 19. A rival family tried to drown me in the Han River. Obviously, they failed." Avery moved closer, studying the intricate patterns. Each scale was individually detailed, the serpent's mouth open near his jawline as if striking. "The dragon on my back," he continued, "was for surviving a knife attack in Busan. 16 stitches. The chrysanthemum on my shoulder, that was for my mother's funeral. Every mark is a story of something that should have ended me, but didn't. You are your survival on your skin," Avery said quietly. "And you?" He crushed the cigarette beneath his shoe. "Why Korea? Of all the places you could have run, why here?" She looked out at the city, at the incomprehensible beauty of Hangul signs glowing in the darkness. "I wanted to disappear into somewhere I couldn't understand. A place where I'd have to relearn everything, the language, the customs, how to order food. I thought if I made myself small enough, invisible enough, Derek wouldn't find me." She laughed bitterly. "Turns out, I just needed to be somewhere Derek couldn't control. I didn't realize that meant finding someone else who could." Dong-Hyun was quiet for a long moment. "There's a difference between control and protection. You'll learn it eventually." "Will I?" He met her eyes. "That depends on whether you're still running, or whether you've finally decided to stand still." The revelation came 3 days after the Lotus burned, delivered by a thin man in wire-rimmed glasses who looked more like an accountant than an intelligence operative. Avery sat in Dong-Hyun's study while the man spread photographs and documents across the mahogany desk, shipping manifests, bank transfers, surveillance images of Derek meeting with men in expensive suits outside a warehouse in Incheon. The Choi family, Min-jun translated, his finger tapping one photograph. Derek offered them 15% equity in his family's shipping operation. In exchange, they provide manpower and territorial access in Seoul. He looked at Dong-Hyun. He's not just coming for her anymore. He's buying a war. Dong-Hyun studied the documents with the same methodical calm he brought to everything, his tattooed fingers tracing the connections between names and locations. The Choice have been looking for legitimate shipping routes to move their operations international. Derek just handed them a golden bridge. This stops being about a woman, the thin man said in accented English, glancing at Avery. This becomes about respect.
Territory.
If the other families think you can be pressured through a personal vendetta, they'll all start testing your boundaries. Avery felt the weight of their stares, the unspoken accusation that she'd brought a match into a room full of gasoline. I can leave, she said quietly, if that solves.
No.
Dong-Hyun's voice cut through the room like a blade. He set down the photographs with deliberate care. That's exactly what Derek wants. He burns my club, allies with my competitors, and expects me to hand over what he considers as property to avoid conflict. He leaned back in his chair, his expression carved from ice. Every family in Seoul is watching to see if the Viper can be bought off with threats. If I give you up, I might as well paint a target on everything I've built. Min-jun's jaw tightened. So we're going to war over this? We're going to make an example, Dong-Hyun corrected. Derek thinks he understands power because his family has money and shipping routes. The Choice think they can leverage a foreigner's obsession into territorial gains. He stood, buttoning his suit jacket with mechanical precision. They both need to learn that some things, once claimed, are not negotiable. He looked at Avery, and for the first time, she saw something beyond cold calculation in his eyes, something almost possessive. You're not a woman anymore, Miss Monroe. You're a principal. And I don't compromise on principles. The restaurant occupied the top floor of a glass tower in Gangnam, the kind of place where a single meal cost more than Avery used to make in a week. Derek had chosen it carefully, neutral ground, public enough to prevent overt violence, exclusive enough to ensure privacy. Dong-Hyun had accepted the invitation with a single condition: Avery would attend. He needs to see that you're under my protection by choice, not force. Dong-Hyun had explained while Mrs. Choi helped Avery into a black dress that probably cost more than her former rent. Otherwise, he'll continue to believe you're a hostage he can rescue. Now she sat beside Dong-Hyun at a table overlooking the glittering cityscape, her hands folded in her lap to hide their trembling. Derek arrived precisely on time, flanked by two Choi family representatives, older men in tailored suits who radiated quiet menace. Derek looked exactly as she remembered. Handsome in that all-American way, his smile easy and practiced, his eyes utterly dead. Avery, he said warmly, as if they were old friends reuniting. You look well. Seoul clearly agrees with you. She said nothing. Dong-Hyun had instructed her to remain silent unless directly addressed, to let him handle the performance. Derek sat across from them, accepting a menu he didn't bother reading. Mr. Seo, I appreciate you taking this meeting. I think we can resolve this situation in a way that benefits everyone. He leaned forward, his tone reasonable, almost apologetic. I'm prepared to offer $2 million for Avery's safe return to the States, plus an additional $1 million for the inconvenience I've caused your business operations. Generous, Dong-Hyun said, his voice devoid of inflection. I think so. Derek's smile widened. We're both businessmen. Surely we can agree that no woman is worth starting a war over. Dong-Hyun set down his water glass with precise care. I've acquired your debts, he said calmly. All of them. The gambling markers in Macau, the margin calls on your cryptocurrency speculation, the bridge loan you took from that hedge fund in the Caymans. Total exposure, approximately $8 million. I purchased it all at 40 cents on the dollar. Derek's smile faltered. I also now own a controlling interest in your primary shipping contractor, Dong-Hyun continued, and I've shared certain financial irregularities with the SEC. As for the Choi family, he glanced at the two men flanking Derek. They've accepted a more lucrative arrangement with me. Your partnership was dissolved this morning. The silence stretched. Derek's face had gone white, then red. You can't. I already have. Dong-Hyun stood, offering his hand to Avery. Enjoy your meal, Mr. Derek. I understand the salmon here is exceptional. The parking garage was poorly lit, concrete pillars casting long shadows between the luxury vehicles. Avery walked beside Dong-Hyun toward his car, Min-jun and two other guards flanking them in a protective formation. The evening had gone exactly as planned. Derek humiliated, his allies turned, his leverage destroyed. She should have felt relief. Instead, her nerves screamed that something was wrong. The first shot shattered the rear window of a Mercedes 3 cars away. Everything happened in fragmented seconds. Min-jun shoved Avery behind a concrete pillar while drawing his weapon. Dong-Hyun's other guards scattered, returning fire toward the source. Muzzle flashes lit up the darkness like lightning. 3 shooters positioned behind vehicles on the upper level, their angle carefully calculated for the ambush. Avery pressed herself against the pillar, her heart hammering so hard she thought her ribs would crack. She heard Derek's voice echoing through the garage, directing his hired guns in clipped commands. He'd never intended to negotiate. The restaurant had been theater, a way to confirm she'd be in this garage at this exact time. Stay down, Min-jun barked, firing 3 rounds toward the upper level. But Derek had moved, circling around through the stairwell while his shooters kept Dong-Hyun's men pinned. Avery saw him emerge from behind an SUV 15 feet away, a pistol held in both hands, his face transformed into something feral and unrecognizable. The gun wasn't pointed at Dong-Hyun or the guards. It was pointed directly at her. Time crystallized. She saw Derek's finger tightening on the trigger, saw the absolute conviction in his eyes that if he couldn't have her, no one would. She tried to move, but her legs wouldn't respond. Dong-Hyun stepped into the space between them. The gunshot was deafening in the enclosed concrete space. Dong-Hyun's body jerked, his shoulder blooming red as the bullet punched through expensive fabric and flesh. He staggered but didn't fall, and in that moment Min-jun's shot took Derek in the leg, dropping him to the ground screaming. The remaining shooters were eliminated in seconds, professional, surgical, final. Dong-Hyun collapsed forward, and Avery caught him, his weight driving them both to their knees on the oil-stained concrete. His blood was warm and wet against her hands, soaking through her dress. His face had gone pale, but his eyes remained sharp, focused on hers. Told you, he whispered, his tattooed hand finding hers. Nothing leaves my home without permission. Behind them, Min-jun was dragging Derek toward a black van, the screaming already being muffled. That mercy wouldn't last the night. The penthouse smelled of antiseptic and blood. Avery's hands still shook as she held the gauze while the doctor, a severe woman who'd arrived within minutes and asked no questions, worked on Dong-Hyun's shoulder. The bullet had gone clean through, missing bone and major arteries by centimeters. Lucky, the doctor said in clipped English. Another inch, and he'd have bled out in that garage. Dong-Hyun sat shirtless on the edge of his bed, his torso a canvas of tattoos and old scars, now joined by fresh stitches and white bandaging. He hadn't made a sound during the entire procedure, hadn't taken the painkillers the doctor offered. He just watched Avery's face while she tried not to fall apart. When the doctor finally left, silence filled the room like water rising. Mrs. Choi had cleaned the blood from Avery's hands and dress, but she could still feel it, warm and sticky, the visceral proof that someone had stepped between her and a bullet. It's over, Dong-Hyun said finally, his voice rougher than usual. Derek won't be found. The Choi family has formally apologized and paid reparations. The other families understand the cost of challenging my territory. He reached for a folder on the nightstand, wincing slightly at the movement. These are for you. New passport, new identity, bank account with enough money to start over anywhere you want. Canada, Europe, back to the States if you prefer. You're free. Avery stared at the folder like it was a weapon. Free. You came to me for protection from a threat. The threat is eliminated. He met her eyes, and for the first time since she'd known him, she saw something uncertain in that dark gaze. You don't owe me anything, Miss Monroe. You can finally have the life you ran to Korea to find. She looked at the folder, then at the man who'd taken a bullet meant for her. At the serpent tattoo on his neck, each scale a story of survival. At the bandage blooming red where he'd proven protection was more than a business transaction. Beyond the windows, Seoul glittered like a constellation brought to earth. I'm not running anymore, she said quietly. Her hand found his, her brown fingers threading through his tattooed ones. You said I was yours, that I belonged to you the moment I knelt at your feet. She held his gaze. That makes you mine too. Something shifted in his expression, not quite a smile, but close. You understand what that means? What this life is. I understand that I'm not a guest anymore. Not a debt to be paid or a principle to be defended. She squeezed his hand. I'm choosing to stay. He pulled her closer, his good arm wrapping around her waist. Then welcome home.